So can you tell us a little bit about some of the detail that you've put into... I mean, I've been to the... Back up slightly, I've been to the Warner Brothers studio experience. It's utterly fabulous. I think the 4 hours I was able to spend wasn't anywhere near enough. So I'm going to go back and do the whole thing again. But just to explain a little level of the detail that went into the whole project and what that's given to... What do you think it's given to the films?
Well, I mean, my responsibility was really for sets and miniatures. Sets being everything. I think the first thing I did when I started on Harry Potter 1 was the Gryffindor boys' dormitory, which was great to get involved with. That kind of set me off. And then throughout the series, I then worked on Hogwarts Castle, full-size sets, and the miniature, and everything, Hogsmeade Village, Shell Cottage, that kind of thing. So, and at every stage of the way, be it a miniature or a full-size set, I think one thing that Stuart Craig, who is the production designer who kind of oversaw everything that Mira and Eduardo and myself and the enormous team that we had there, Stuart, everything, the level of detail that he wants to achieve is, kind of rubbed off on us, and we kind of
really
took that
annoying.
on board, and whether that was a piece of architectural detailing on a doorway for Hogwarts, he would go and send us to Oxford colleges, so a little corbel, and whatever that stonework detail we would incorporate into the drawings to then go into the sets and the miniature, or whether it be a weather vane on the boathouse, we would go through various designs, and so everything, as well as the sort of broad strokes of the design of the sets, every little detail, even the door hinges, we would design and we'd look at reference. And one thing that Stuart was very keen on was basing things in reality. So, if you could go to an Oxford college or you go to Durham Cathedral and see some of those details, he would want to include those in the set. So when the viewer's watching it, you could believe you were in a real place.
Yeah, and we always cite that as well when we're talking about the graphic work, which was that, our job was sort of a layer on top of what they had already done in the architecture, and I guess we had more responsibility to add the sort of the Wizarding World twist to what had been created in reality, and I think Stuart's sort of ethos always was, take something that's real and just shift it ever so slightly into an alternative universe, because that gives the viewer much more. It connects, and it gives them a chance to sort of feel like they can go to Hogwarts, or that they can take some ownership of the environment and of the story, and ultimately it's about that really, it's sort of being able to resonate with them.
And I think that's the fabulous word there, is ownership, because this here is one example of that everybody has taken ownership of kind of that whole world. Are there any particular details that you're pleased with, or that you snuck in?
We quite like to know that all the book covers, all the books, they have pages inside. That is kind of surprised people all the time when we say that.
Newspapers as
and
well.
the newspapers, every single page in the newspaper is different. We have, of course, like a few pages that isn't just to make the volume, but the front cover, the back cover, and even the pages inside is all different. And again,
they're all rooted in how a real newspaper would be, so that you can just believe it when you see it, and then realise that actually it's the stories that it's talking about are about the Wizarding World, or the way that they're set out on the newspaper are slightly different from the real world. So everything is anchored in this reality before it's then moved, and we do that through looking at reference, and that's kind of fundamental to right across the design team. And we have a researcher who works pretty much all the way through the design process, as well as ourselves going and finding reference. But I think that's key to all of our work.
And where did the kind of combined vision from? Because you talk about the Oxford universities, but the inside of the Ministry of Magic has quite a different feel to it. So where did those visions come from? Are they driven by the books, or?
I think partly that, and also I think Stuart had this idea that because it was underground, he kind of riffed off the idea of underground tube stations
and
that
London,
tiling, and it's London. So a lot of the Leslie Green tube stations that were built, that kind of blood ceramic
and
tile,
glazed,
and the glazed tiles and the green.
And again, it's
very
taking
much that kind of
it's taking a sort of a key route element, if you
Yes.
like, which might have just been, I don't know for him, if you can speak for him, but an element like that aesthetic of the tiles, and then just running with it and taking it to much
Another
greater.
level. It's something I
Yeah.
think people, particularly who live in London, are familiar with that vocabulary of architecture, if you want to put it that way. And we've all seen those tube stations, we've all seen the glazed ceramic tiles, and then you look at it, and then it's just times 10, and there it is in the most sort of fantastical combination of shapes.
But the great thing about Harry Potter is that we could mix lots of different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
And at the end kind of makes sense because it's a created world anyway. With the graphics we could do that. There's like Victorian, there's like Gothic, there's 1950s and 70s
And often it's
graphic.
this moment in the story or the characters in that moment that will kind of inform the direction of that. So I'm sure that, for example, the Ministry of Magic, we knew that it needed to be this very imperial kind of environment. So even though it was like taking this tube, the underground aesthetic, it still needed to be kind of almost like a cathedral,
Yes, absolutely.
somewhere that was really going to be dominant and demeaning to its employees and all of that wonderful statue with the workers oppressed, and it's a combination of taking a sort of real reference and then understanding what those characters and the story needs to be told in that particular moment and giving it the backstory.
And that is the brilliance of Stuart Craig. I think all of us look up to him as one of the finest designers
And as
currently working, really.
Sorry, and as the story overall got darker, was there kind of a consensus on the visuals changing in terms of colours and?
There was actually. Hogwarts Castle itself, the miniature that we built on Harry Potter 1, and was used throughout up until Harry Potter 6. We physically painted it darker.
And Gary's had to redraw the whole architecture many times, haven't you?
Oh yes, I mean it's something you touched on earlier about getting away with a lot and mixing it up. The design of Hogwarts Castle didn't remain the same over 2 films. It changed in every single film because there was a new script requirement. Be it Sirius Black's tower where he's imprisoned, or be it the astronomy tower where Dumbledore falls. Each one of those elements, we never knew that they existed in the subsequent books from books 1, 2, and 3 that were out when we started on Harry Potter 1. Yeah. So it kept us all busy because we just kept redesigning and rebuilding Hogwarts Castle. And if anyone questioned it, we say, well, it's magic. Of course it's going to change. And sometimes even the aesthetic of the castle, Stuart always wanted, I don't know, if you look at the early films, there's part of Hogwarts Castle that's based on Durham Cathedral, 2 square towers. And in the early films, there are very shallow little sort of conical caps on the top of those towers. And Stuart had always wanted to have something much more kind of vertiginous and much taller. So I think Harry Potter 4 or 5, we actually put tall spires on. So although that wasn't script-led, it's something that Stuart had always regretted in the first film not doing, and he said, let's try and get them in on this. So again, it's magic because it evolves and develops. So you can always see if there's a still of Hogwarts in any given publication, which film it was from.
But to answer your question as well about the story, the direction of the story and the dynamic and personality of what was going on, we certainly had to do that with things when we were redesigning them. I think with the Daily Prophet, that went through all sorts of, when the Ministry of Magic took over the editorial of that, we changed the look and looked at Russian constructivist propaganda material to reflect what we were saying earlier about the dominance and lack of free speech and so on. So yes, that was quite unusual in working on it. Normally you work on a film, maybe 2 films that are from the same series or 3, but to have 8
films
where things can evolve and be reconsidered, and but the evolution was great when we had the opportunity to do that.
But I remember every time we were stuck with something like the production and have meetings, they say, it's the magic, and people didn't like that. So they always know now we have to find a solution. So there's no need to think too much. It's magic, and they didn't like it. But it's magic in the end. So.
Do you think the Potter series is different in the way that you've been able to support the story in such an obvious way? Because you were saying about the Ministry of Magic and in the way that you've done the set design and everything that goes with that, you've been able to support the story in a very direct way. Is that the same in other films, or have you been fortunate in this sense?
I think for us as graphic designers, it's unusual to have so many props that are scripted. So if they're mentioned in the story, in the script, as key elements to drive the story, then often our job as graphic designers is more to sort of create the background, and it might be things that you'll have seen things in films, but someone's had to design them, but they weren't necessarily in someone's hand or directed part of the story.
Usually every film has like graphic props that are important, like there's a letter, or there's a folder, there's a document. But in Harry Potter, the brilliant thing was that people grow up and knowing what the Marauder's map was, the Quibbler, the Daily Prophet, and when we were creating that, at the beginning we didn't realize
that we were giving an identity to those things that were in people's heads,
yeah.
and now it's really nice if people have said all that.
Because people come to us now and say, thank you to make my childhood
I think
more colourful,
the
and
they were characters in their own right, like the Marauder's Map, the Daily Prophet.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, actually, because
really
it feels like that to us, but then we're a bit like inward.
Mauda's maps, I mean, you can see the T-shirts, and there's
they're iconic
going
things.
around with the Mauda's map on her dress.
Yeah.
She's got, I think it's fabulous. And the other word that springs to mind is howler. You have to do that.
Yeah, that was us, yeah. We didn't have to do the complicated animated bit, but we had to do when it was closed and when it was angry, and someone else did the bit in between.
And it's nice to know that the main prop of the film that sets the story is the letter that you have to write. If he didn't receive that letter, there was no film. So thanks, Mim.
So yeah, but that's the same for. I think to answer your question about on other films, do we? I guess our fundamental job is to help tell the story with those visual elements. Whether it's how something's aged, or you're always trying to tell a bit of a backstory up to the moment that you see it in the film, and you're, as a viewer, you're supposed to just accept that's the given. And usually there's a whole complex arrangement of things that have happened to get the set built and dressed in that way and aged or whatever it is.
And talking of backstories, what was the furthest you went with any one particular thing as far as backstories went? Did you create backstories for some of the things, or were you given?
Well, the newspapers have actually got stories that go from one side. I mean, we used to sometimes just actually, you contributed to some of them, but we used to sometimes just put up a thing in the kitchen saying, can we have some contributions, and
some names and headlines, because
we had to write something, we couldn't write blah blah blah. So, and some stories did carry through. So if you picked up a whole load of Daily Prophets from different films, you'd see that there were the Ginger Witch was in and out of Azkaban for various illegal henna.
And Ginger Witch was Debbie. She was a production buyer that works with her.
So yeah, there's lots of family members. There's lots of.
I think
you wrote one of the books. You wrote Hogwarts History.
Yeah.
Giving it all.
I also had a bottle of whiskey, I think, in the leaky corner. Tomkins whiskey.
Yeah. So everyone in the department gets thrown in.
But I think that level of detail that sometimes you don't see, or on the films, we carried that through even with the miniatures. So on Hogsmeade Village, we created this fantastic model, which took something in the region of probably 6 months to build. All the shop fronts had their windows dressed. We made little tiny books for the bookshop, put it in the window, and then in the final film, the camera came down, went over the model, and went, really?
But
we knew it was there.
What's the exact scale that you built it?
I think that was about.
I mean, even Hogwarts.
Hogwarts was 1/24th, I think, and then Hogsmeade Village was a little bit bigger than that.
You've seen the model, haven't you?
The figures are about that big. So all that. I don't know. I want to put Hogsmeade into the Warner Brothers.
Find another excuse.
It's a fantastic model, and we really didn't see enough of it on film. Yeah. Whereas Hogwarts Castle itself is a fantastic thing. We've really shot every inch of that. Hogsmeade Village was a kind of lost opportunity, really.
So whereabouts is the Hogsmeade model now?
It's in storage somewhere.
In a
warehouse somewhere.
Speaking of which, is there anything at home either which came off a set, or copies of a newspaper, or designs?
No, we're not.
You haven't incorporated any of the designs into your own homes, have you?
No, me and Mira, we are still very involved with Harry Potter. Now we have a license to reproduce as graphic, as limited edition prints, and we work for the theme park, so we're still living this magical world every day.
Yeah.
So we do have a few things, but it's all related to the work that we still carry on doing. But
And can I ask, are you all involved with Fantastic Beasts?
And this will have to be the last question.
That was a good last question,
Are you
because that's
involved with
just...
Fantastic Beasts?
Yes.
we are, yeah.
Yeah.
Sadly, I'm
Can't
not.
say.
I'm currently working on Star Wars, so I'm in a galaxy far, far away.
Right.
I would love
Conflict
to work
with
on
the dark side.
one can't do everything. only one major franchise at a time.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey, you guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey,